now time for Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. Inflation has been off the charts over the past year, and it's set to continue in South Korea, higher than the rate of economic growth, which will be slightly lower than previously forecast, according to the Asia Development Bank's report this week. Along with the rest of Asia, South Korea is expected to be impacted by geopolitical uncertainties, supply chain weaknesses, and, of course, the global pandemic. We discuss what's on the cards for the South Korean economy today, and for this, we're joined by John Beirne, Vice Chair of Research and Senior Research Fellow of Asian Development Bank Institute. Very warm welcome to you. And we also connect with Professor Song Soo-young, Professor of Finance in the College of Business and Economics at Chungang University in Seoul. Thank you for joining us. And first of all, my first question to you, Dr. Beirne. Now, your institute, your organisation, its projection on Asian economies released this week showed that South Korea is expected to see inflation hit 3.2% this year, while its GDP is going to grow by 3%. Does this mean that inflation is outpacing economic growth?
Well, I think it's important to understand what the medium-term projection is for inflation. So you rightly say that inflation at the moment in Korea is at 3.1%, and a large factor behind this is due to the Ukraine situation and external factors coming from the rises in commodity prices. So to the extent that these inflationary impacts from the Korean War would impact the medium-term horizon for inflation, then Korean policymakers should be concerned about that from a monetary policy perspective. It's of course very difficult to understand the length of time that this would continue to take place. So it requires further monitoring on whether the inflationary pressures that we observe from these external events at the geopolitical level will have longer term implications over the horizon and second round effects, which would require monetary policy action.
And Professor Song, now inflation is a huge concern for South Korea. How vulnerable is South Korea to commodity prices, and what factors do you expect will keep pushing prices up in the country?
Yeah, as you mentioned earlier, and Dr. Burns also mentioned, that the primary factor that affects the Korean economic inflation is due to the supply disruption. That is a common factor, and the energy price rise because of the shortage of the supply energy, and partly due to the Russian-Ukraine war. In Korea, particularly, the inflation rate is actually almost as half of the U.S., at least for the February 2022. To that regard, our situation is, so in comparison to other advanced countries around the world, inflation is not all much concern, but that is in relative sense. So I think that inflation is clearly because of because we South Korea does not have any reserve energy enough to. Because we don't have any such materials within the country at all, so that is a really serious threat. So my concern lies in the impact of the energy price, unless it is transitory. It could have a very significant impact on the economy.
And Dr. Beirne, well, as the war in Ukraine continues, what are the most vulnerable areas of exposure for countries in East Asia? I mean, they're also trying to recover from supply chain shocks and the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yes, it's a very good question. I mean, I think as we saw in the latter part of 2021 and the start of this year, that exports have started to recover from the region. And part of the reason for that, of course, was because supply chains had started to repair in the post-pandemic era. Now, of course, we face the opposite effect, whereby supply chains are again becoming interrupted due to the Ukraine war, and this creates clear negative implications for exporters from the region to the extent that they would be involved in these supply chains. Another vulnerability comes from companies and firms who would be exposed to global commodity price shifts and also wider financial market uncertainty. So I think that given this uncertainty, the outlook remains a little bit less certain as it did prior to the war, and it requires very close monitoring in the months ahead.
And Dr. Beirne, what is the general trajectory that economic policymakers in East Asia are following to fully recover from the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yes, this is another good question. Of course, I think that one of the outcomes of the pandemic was an increase in debt, not only public levels of debt but also private debt, and this is a concern potentially over the longer term in terms of underpinning the economic recovery process to the extent that this debt would become unsustainable over time. So policymakers certainly face challenges on the private debt side from a macroprudential perspective, and also there exists some fiscal sustainability challenges over the horizon as well. I would say that overall trade and investment remains quite robust, but there are also lessons to be learned. It's not only from the pandemic but also from the current conflict that what we need to build is a more resilient global supply chain network and a more diversified supply chain and less concentration risk in key sectors, which would support production over the longer term.
And Professor Song, now as South Korea looks to recover, South Koreans face numerous economic concerns, most of them structural. There's a high level of debt, inflation as well, as we're seeing, and of course stagnant wage growth. What measures are urgently needed, do you think?
I think the high level of debt, particularly of concern in South Korea, is the household debt, because not the absolute level of the household debt against the debt disposable income. Actually, that is when we compare that with the other advanced countries, such as, for example, Denmark or some other countries. Denmark, Norway, Netherlands, Switzerland. Still, we are very in terms of the size of the percentage of the household debt against the net disposable income is 201%, which is very similar to of the Australia. And Denmark and Norway, Netherlands, Switzerland is the high or very high. So household debt issue is because of the speed of the velocity of the increased household debt is very dramatic in South Korea. So that is of concern. But however, still in terms of the national government debt against the GDP is quite low among the advanced countries in South Korea. So we need to some balance. We need to achieve some balance between the household debt and the government debt, because government has a much more resilience and much more strong power to support the economy. So to that regard, I think the household debt and also the inflation is, as I mentioned earlier, is not. I don't think that is currently, given the level of the inflation rate, and is not. I don't have much concern about the inflation rate. But however, there are some specific concerns about depending upon the specific countries may have different problems. So that is the issue which should be addressed.
I see. And Dr. Beirne, well, not just in South Korea, but all around the world, really, it's been a period of fiscal tightening, monetary tightening, for central banks. But this coincides with a high level of debt. Now, how should policymakers soften the blow on indebted households and companies?
Well, I think that's a very interesting question. So we're talking about private debt, household and corporate debt. Let's take corporate debt first of all. I think that there's an exposure here to external events. In particular, we can see at the moment the US is undergoing a monetary policy tightening, and corporate debt buildup in Asia would be exposed to the extent that it has large buildups of US dollar denominated debt. So it would be exposed to an appreciation of the dollar in this case. So this is something that needs to be monitored. In terms of household debt, I think that this has already been discussed, but to the extent that this would spill over to broader financial stability risks is an important thing to consider. In the case of Korea, for example, loan-to-value ratios are quite low. So I think there's a lid on the extent that household debt would have wider financial vulnerabilities for the economy. But certainly one of the outcomes driven by the low interest rate environment, of course, was a large buildup of private debt. And it's important that financial supervisors and macroprudential policy has a role to play to ensure that these debt vulnerabilities do not spill over to the banking sector and lead to a situation where we would have rising non-performing loans, which would have serious financial stability implications.
And now, Dr. Beirne, when it comes to the country's economic growth this year, your organisation has projected that there will be a sort of pickup in exports and private consumption as well. But of course, South Korea is it's a highly trade-dependent country, and most of our exports, a lot of our exports make up our annual GDP, of course. And what long-lasting effects do you expect the ongoing supply chain crisis to have on East Asian economies such as South Korea's?
Well, yes, as we mentioned earlier, the supply chain is a particular vulnerability that we can see emerging from the Ukraine war. And, you know, when firms are reliant on exports, disruptions and impairments to the supply chain can really impact the extent to which these exports can take place. As we saw after the pandemic, export rises were really driven by repairments that we saw in the supply chain, and the Ukraine war is leading to a situation where the reverse is taking place, interruptions in the supply chain, and by extension, we should have some negative repercussions for exports. So yes, hopefully it will be, of course, a transitory event, but over the longer term, as I said earlier, building resilience in supply chains, not only to war, but also to natural disasters and other types of issues like this, will be important over the longer term to make economies more resilient to these interruptions that can be observed in supply chains and enable them to, in this way, weather the storm.
And Professor Song, in terms of building such resilience in the supply chain, for South Korea, how important is it for the country to join regional economic initiatives such as the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, as well as the US's Indo-Pacific Economic Framework?
As for the Comprehensive Progressive CPTPP, actually, which was initiated by Japan, and then the United States has not participated in the CPTPP because already China is already joined. But as for the IEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, that is the United States tried to contain the China from participating in that framework. So this is a very delicate issue, and maybe South Korea is maybe positioned in some dilemma situation because Korea, as you mentioned, that Korea has depended upon too much on the international trade. So supply chain, or if the blockade which was imposed on the side of both sides of the China, Russia side, and the United States and the Western country side, then that could cause a serious problem. So currently, if Korea is forced to choose one of the two, not to choose or not to take some balancing position between the two blocks. But to that regard, South Korea is right now in the very delicate issue, the balancing situation. So I would like to say South Korea anyway managed to balance those two blocks, unless which was maybe the world economy or world political situation went back to return to some Cold War era. So unless we face that situation, we have to keep the balancing position. Otherwise, it could pose a really serious threat against South Korea, not only as well as economically as well as politically.
I see. And Dr. Beirne, now, before we go, what are you factoring into your growth forecasts for key Asian economies this year?
Well, I think that export performance and investment flows have remained strong before the war in Ukraine. Of course, this has created some uncertainties in the period ahead and will affect the outlook over the course of 2022. And this is something that we need to monitor. Inflation will be a concern in this regard, and pass-through of commodity price inflation to domestic inflation rates in the economies in Asia. The second risk relates to supply chain disruptions, and the length of time that this would continue would, of course, impact economic growth over the longer term. And the third, more general risk, also related to those two factors, would be an increase in economic uncertainty and financial market uncertainty. And this increase in volatility would, of course, affect asset prices in the region as well. So I think that we are broadly positive in spite of these risks. Certainly, investment has remained resilient over the past, certainly during 2021 and at the start of 2022 as well. So we don't expect differences there from our central projection. But as I said, interruptions to exports via the supply chain would have material impacts on economic growth coming from that sector of the economy.
That was John Beirne, Vice Chair of Research at Asian Development Bank Institute, and Song Soo-young, Professor at Chungang University in Seoul. Thank you both again so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.